The courtroom was suffocating that day in Fresno, California, not just from the summer heat, but from the gravity of the moment. The air buzzed with tension, every seat filled, every eye trained on one man, Judge Malcolm Brewer. His name was synonymous with justice, his decisions etched in stone. At 62, with 35 years on the bench, he was a man shaped by the weight of his role. His stern demeanor, sharp eyes, and chiseled features were the embodiment of unyielding authority. Across the room, Ryan Hale stood at the defense table, his hands trembling but his gaze defiant. At just 24, he had spent the past year proclaiming his innocence, accused of an armed robbery that left one man critically injured. His voice had been drowned out by a mountain of evidence, eyewitness accounts, surveillance footage, and an anonymous tip. Today, none of that mattered. Today, judgment would be delivered. "Mr. Hale," Judge Brewer began, his deep voice cutting through the heavy silence, "you stand convicted by a jury of your peers for crimes that have caused irreparable harm to this community. Your actions were not only reckless but calculated. You have shown no remorse." In the back row, Ryan's mother stifled a sob, her hands gripping the edges of her seat. She had written letters, begged for leniency, and pleaded for the court to see her son not as a criminal, but as the boy who once dreamed of becoming a firefighter. But the evidence had drowned out her pleas. "I hereby sentence you to 60 years in state prison," Judge Brewer declared, his gavel striking the block with a resounding finality. The room erupted in a cacophony of gasps, whispers, and the hurried scribbles of reporters. Ryan remained motionless, his lips pressed into a thin line, his jaw tightening as if to contain words that would change nothing. His eyes sought out his mother one last time before he was led away, the sound of his shackled footsteps fading into the corridor. Judge Brewer returned to his chambers, shutting the door on the noise and pouring himself a cup of coffee. The day had been long, but justice had been served. Or so he thought. Yet, as he stared into the swirling black liquid, a faint unease crept into his mind, a feeling he quickly dismissed as fatigue. The Hale robbery case had been the talk of the town. A masked gunman had stormed Carter's Jewelers on a busy Thursday afternoon, stealing over $150,000 worth of jewelry and leaving a store clerk, Samuel Gaines, fighting for his life. 2 weeks later, Ryan Hale, a part-time mechanic with no criminal record, was arrested. An anonymous tip led authorities to a storage unit in his name, where stolen goods were discovered. The evidence was damning. Fingerprints on the weapon left at the scene, grainy surveillance footage showing a man of similar build, and witnesses who swore they recognized Ryan's voice. His defense attorney struggled to poke holes in the prosecution's airtight case. Ryan's alibi, that he was working a double shift at the auto shop, crumbled when his boss admitted he couldn't account for Ryan's whereabouts all day. "I didn't do this," Ryan told the jury, his voice steady but desperate. "I wasn't anywhere near that store. I've never even touched a gun." The prosecution's closing argument was brutal. "The evidence doesn't lie. The fingerprints don't lie. The witnesses don't lie," the district attorney declared. The jury took less than 3 hours to convict him on all counts. Judge Brewer delivered the sentence without hesitation, believing he had put another criminal behind bars. Yet, as he signed the sentencing papers later that evening, a faint unease lingered, a flicker of doubt he couldn't quite name. He pushed it aside. But the story wasn't over. On an unremarkable Wednesday evening, Judge Brewer sat in his study, the warm glow of a desk lamp casting long shadows over stacks of legal briefs. Retirement had been on his mind, but tonight, work demanded his attention. He reached for a file, his thoughts wandering back to the Hale case. Then, the phone rang. What began as an ordinary night would soon unravel into a cascade of revelations. A forgotten piece of evidence, long buried, had resurfaced, one that would challenge everything Judge Brewer thought he knew about justice. Beneath the surface of the case lay a web of corruption so deep, it threatened to shake the foundation of the very system he had devoted his life to upholding. And the truth, clawing its way to the light, was just beginning to be uncovered. A new case had landed on Judge Brewer's desk, one steeped in allegations of police misconduct. It wasn't the first time he'd encountered such claims, but something about this one demanded his full attention. As he sifted through the dense stack of documents, An evidence log from a prior investigation caught his eye. At first, it seemed inconsequential, just another line in the endless sea of paperwork. But then a name jumped out at him, Ryan Hale. Brewer leaned back in his chair, his frown deepening. Names resurfaced in unrelated cases all the time, but this felt different. His pulse quickened as he turned the page. The log detailed items confiscated during a separate robbery investigation that had occurred around the same time as the Carter's Jewelers case. One item stood out, a gun. The description matched the weapon used in the robbery for which Ryan had been convicted. But there was a problem. This gun had never been submitted as evidence in Ryan's trial. In fact, it hadn't been mentioned at all. Brewer leaned forward, the weight of his discovery pressing down on him. He cross-referenced the serial number with the trial documents, his memory still sharp despite the passage of time. The match was undeniable. Same make, same scratches on the barrel. Yet, according to the report, this gun had been seized during an unrelated arrest 2 days after the Carter's Jewelers robbery. How is that possible? Brewer muttered, his voice low but taut with tension. If the gun had been in police custody, it couldn't have been used in the robbery. And if it wasn't the weapon, then whose fingerprints had been found on it? The questions swirled in his mind, each one more unsettling than the last. Brewer had spent decades navigating the labyrinth of the legal system. He knew how evidence could be misplaced or overlooked. But this didn't feel like a mistake. It felt deliberate. Determined to get to the bottom of it, Brewer requested the full case file for the unrelated robbery. The folder arrived the next morning, thick with reports, photographs, and witness statements. The more he read, the more the threads began to unravel. The arresting officer in the unrelated case was none other than Detective Lewis, the same officer who had testified during Ryan's trial. Brewer's unease deepened. Then there was the anonymous tip that had led to Ryan's arrest. At the time, Brewer had barely given it a second thought. Now, it screamed of foul play. He subpoenaed the records from the tip line, his anxiety mounting with every passing hour. When the documents finally arrived, the truth hit him like a sledgehammer. The call hadn't come from a concerned citizen. It had been made from a burner phone, one registered under Detective Lewis's name. The walls of Brewer's office seemed to close in around him as the realization set in. Ryan Hale had been set up. Evidence had been manipulated. Testimonies had been orchestrated. The 60-year sentence Brewer had handed down wasn't just a mistake. It was a miscarriage of justice. Brewer had always prided himself on his commitment to the law, but now the law felt like quicksand beneath his feet. He knew what had to be done, but the path forward was fraught with peril. The deeper he dug, the darker the picture became. The first breakthrough came over coffee at a diner off Highway 99. Brewer had reached out to an old friend, retired investigator Daniel Hayes, a man known for his no-nonsense approach and uncanny ability to sniff out corruption. Brewer laid out his findings, his voice heavy with the weight of what he had uncovered. "This isn't just negligence, Malcolm," Hayes said, pushing his coffee mug aside. "If what you're saying is true, someone went to great lengths to make sure that kid took the fall." Brewer nodded grimly. "I need proof, Dan. Solid proof." Hayes agreed to help, and within days, the two were neck-deep in police records, witness testimonies, and internal memos. What they uncovered was staggering. Falsified reports, missing evidence logs, and altered witness statements, all aligning with the prosecution's narrative. One witness stood out, a store clerk who had initially identified another man as the suspect before later changing his statement to implicate Ryan. Hayes tracked the man down to a rundown apartment on the outskirts of town. When they confronted him, the truth came tumbling out. "I didn't want to do it," the man confessed, his hands trembling. "But Detective Lewis, he pressured me. Said if I didn't, I'd be arrested for obstruction. I didn't have a choice." The name hit Brewer like a thunderclap. Detective Lewis, the same officer who had filed the false tip, the same one who had concealed the evidence. As Brewer and Hayes dug deeper, a chilling pattern emerged. Lewis had a history of questionable tactics, intimidating witnesses, fabricating evidence, coercing confessions. Yet, his record remained spotless, shielded by layers of bureaucratic red tape. For Brewer, the revelations were both infuriating and devastating. A young man's life had been destroyed, not by the weight of his crimes, but by the corruption of those sworn to uphold the law. Brewer knew the stakes. Exposing the truth would come at a cost, but he also knew there was no turning back. The fight for justice had only just begun. The breakthrough came when Hayes managed to recover deleted emails from Detective Lewis's police account. One email, in particular, stood out like a flashing beacon in the darkness. Addressed to the district attorney, it outlined a calculated plan to secure a conviction in the Carter's Jewelers case. Attached to the email was a damning list of fabricated evidence and doctored witness statements. As Judge Brewer read the email, a surge of rage coursed through him. The very system he had devoted his life to, the one he believed in, was rotten to its core. Yet, despair was a luxury he couldn't afford. He now held the proof he needed to act, but exposing the truth wouldn't come without a cost. Lewis wasn't just any detective. He had powerful allies within the department, people who would go to great lengths to protect him. Brewer knew that going public could cost him everything: his career, his reputation, even his safety. But when he thought of Ryan Hale sitting in a prison cell for a crime he didn't commit, the decision became clear. "We go public," Brewer told Hayes one evening as they pored over the mounting evidence. "No matter what it takes." The next day, Brewer filed a motion to reopen Ryan's case, attaching the damning evidence against Lewis. The motion sent shockwaves through the courthouse and rippled through the entire legal community. But Brewer wasn't finished. He also filed a formal complaint with the Department of Justice, calling for an independent investigation into Lewis and the Fresno Police Department. The backlash was immediate and fierce. Brewer began receiving anonymous threats, letters, phone calls, and chilling silence on the other end of the line. One morning, he stepped outside to find his car tires slashed. A crude note scrawled across his windshield, "Drop it or else." Despite the escalating threats, Brewer stood firm. He had seen too many lives ruined by systemic corruption, and he wasn't about to let fear deter him. Ryan Hale's face lingered in his thoughts, a young man wronged by the very system that should have protected him. Meanwhile, Lewis fought back with calculated precision. Through his attorney, he denied the allegations, claiming Brewer's motion was nothing more than a baseless vendetta. "This is a witch hunt," Lewis declared in a televised interview, his polished demeanor masking the cracks in his defense. "Judge Brewer is trying to destroy my career to save his own reputation." Brewer watched the interview from his living room, his jaw tightening as he listened to the lies. Lewis's boldness was infuriating, but Brewer had something Lewis didn't: the truth. As the investigation deepened, Hayes uncovered a critical piece of evidence: security camera footage from a parking lot near the jewelry store, recorded on the day of the robbery. The footage, which had somehow been omitted from the original trial, showed a man matching Lewis's description leaving the scene with a duffel bag. Brewer's heart raced as he reviewed the tape. This wasn't just exculpatory evidence, it was damning. The robbery hadn't been a random act of violence. It had been orchestrated by Lewis himself. The next step was clear, but it came with immense risk. Brewer called for an emergency hearing to present the new evidence. The courtroom was electric with tension as the footage played on the screen. Gasps rippled through the gallery, the weight of the truth sinking into every corner of the room. "This man," Brewer said, pointing to the screen, "is the same detective who led the investigation against Ryan Hale. He manipulated evidence, coerced witnesses, and framed an innocent man to cover his own tracks." The reaction was immediate. Reporters scrambled to capture the moment, their camera flashes illuminating the courtroom like strobe lights. In the gallery, Lewis sat with his lawyer, his face pale but his eyes burning with defiance. "You're making a mistake, Brewer," Lewis hissed as officers escorted him out in handcuffs. "You don't know what you've started." The confrontation left Brewer shaken but resolute. The case was now in the hands of a higher court, and Ryan Hale's conviction was finally being re-examined. As the courtroom emptied, Brewer stood alone for a moment, the weight of his actions pressing down on him. He had uncovered a rot that went far deeper than he'd ever imagined. And though the truth was out, the battle was far from over. The fight for justice was just beginning. Weeks later, Judge Brewer found himself sitting in the same courtroom where Ryan Hale had once stood to hear his sentence. This time, however, the air was charged with a different energy. The gallery was packed with reporters, activists, and Ryan's family, their faces a mix of hope and trepidation. Ryan sat at the defense table, his hands clasped in front of him. Though thinner and visibly aged from his time in prison, his posture was steady, his gaze unwavering. Brewer felt a lump rise in his throat as he watched the young man who had been at the center of this storm. A man who had endured so much for a crime he hadn't committed. The evidence Brewer and Hayes had unearthed was undeniable. Surveillance footage, falsified reports, coerced testimonies. It painted a damning picture of corruption and a system that had failed not only Ryan but the principles it was meant to uphold. The presiding judge cleared his throat, his voice cutting through the charged silence. After reviewing the new evidence presented, this court finds that the conviction of Ryan Hale was based on manipulated evidence and coerced testimony. Therefore, the conviction is hereby overturned. For a moment, the room was still, as if the weight of those words needed time to sink in. Then, the gallery erupted in applause and tears. Ryan stood slowly, his hands trembling, as his mother rushed to him, wrapping him in a fierce embrace. She wept openly, her sobs a mix of relief and uncontainable joy. Brewer, seated quietly at the back of the courtroom, allowed himself a rare smile. Justice had been served. It wasn't perfect, and it hadn't come easily, but it had prevailed. In the days that followed, the fallout was swift and far-reaching. Detective Lewis faced criminal charges for his actions, and the independent investigation into the Fresno Police Department uncovered a deep-seated culture of corruption that had gone unchecked for years. The revelations sparked nationwide calls for reform, and Brewer's role in exposing the truth became a rallying cry for accountability in the justice system. Despite the accolades and public praise, Brewer remained introspective. He knew this victory was only a single battle in a much larger war. The system he had once trusted so implicitly was flawed, deeply so, but it wasn't beyond repair. Brewer resolved to spend the rest of his career fighting for meaningful change, determined to make the justice system worthy of its name. As for Ryan, his journey was just beginning. Freed from the shadow of a wrongful conviction, he vowed to dedicate his life to helping others who had been unjustly imprisoned. His story became a beacon of hope, a testament to the power of resilience and the pursuit of truth. The story of Ryan Hale and Judge Brewer serves as a powerful reminder that justice is not infallible. It demands vigilance, courage, and an unyielding commitment to confronting uncomfortable truths. It is a call to action for all who believe in fairness and the transformative power of truth. If this story moved you, consider supporting organizations dedicated to freeing the wrongfully convicted and advocating for systemic reform. Your support can help bring justice to those who need it most. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories that inspire, challenge, and shed light on the complexities of justice. Because sometimes the fight for justice doesn't end in the courtroom. It begins there.